Most people think Sun Tzu wrote The Art of War to teach nations how to win battles, dominate enemies, and secure victory at any cost, but that interpretation misses the point entirely. Sun Tzu didn't write The Art of War to teach nations how to fight. He wrote it to teach them how not to go broke. Sun Tzu was not obsessed with winning battles. He was obsessed with avoiding them. He was not interested in glory, honor, or even domination. He was interested in cost, because when Sun Tzu looked at war, he didn't see heroism. He saw invoices. And in a world bleeding itself dry through constant conflict, Sun Tzu became one of the first thinkers in history to make an uncomfortable truth explicit. The greatest threat to a state is not the enemy across the battlefield. It is the bill that arrives afterward. People think the art of war is about fighting. It isn't. It's about finance. To understand Sun Tzu's genius, you have to abandon the modern fantasy version of him and step into the world he actually lived in. Because his ideas were not born from abstract philosophy. They were born from systemic collapse. China, in the late spring and autumn period in the early Warring States era, roughly the 6th to 5th centuries BCE, was not a land of harmony and tradition. It was a pressure cooker, a fractured landscape of rival kingdoms, each convinced it was destined to unify the world, and each draining itself to try. War was no longer occasional. It was constant. Alliances formed, shattered, reformed, and collapsed again. Armies grew larger every decade. Warfare shifted from aristocratic chariot skirmishes into mass infantry mobilizations, the kind that required food, metal supply chains, taxation systems, and bureaucracies on a scale no previous generation had ever managed. States weren't just fighting battles anymore. They were running full-scale stress tests on their economies. Every time a ruler sent an army into the field, he was taking out a loan against his future. Grain diverted from civilians, labor pulled from farms, metal stripped from tools and turned into weapons, taxes raised, debts accumulated, and far too often, those loans came due. Modern audiences tend to imagine ancient warfare as heroic and tactical. Formations, generals, decisive clashes. But in this era, war was logistical before it was anything else. The moment an army moved, the meter started running. Wagons, grain, horses, armorers, cooks, blacksmiths, porters, administrators, all of them had to be fed, supplied, and sustained. A campaign that lasted more than a few months could bankrupt a smaller state. A campaign lasting more than a year could collapse, even a powerful one. And yet the wars continued, not because they were affordable, but because insecurity made them unavoidable. Each kingdom feared that if it paused, its rivals would strike first. It was an arms race centuries before the term existed, and it was grinding the entire political system toward exhaustion. This is the world Sun Tzu walked into, not as a philosopher retreating into quiet contemplation, but as a strategist forced to confront a crisis disguised as military necessity. In the West, he's often imagined as an ancient self-help guru for leaders. In reality, he was closer to something far more modern, a risk manager. Sun Tzu looked at the numbers, the costs, the timelines, the logistics, and he realized something that most rulers refused to accept. The way states were fighting wars was unsustainable. Victory meant nothing if the treasury collapsed afterward, and again, that was exactly what happened. Most rulers believed the enemy's army was their greatest threat. Sun Tzu believed their own spending was. That's why the most important line in The Art of War appears at the very beginning, before deception, before terrain, before morale. He writes, "War is of vital importance to the state, not glorious, not honorable, vital, meaning dangerous, disruptive, capable of destroying the very society it claims to defend. Everything that follows is an attempt to contain war, to control it, limit it, and above all, make it cheaper." When you read the book through this lens, Sun Tzu's obsession becomes unmistakable. Every principle is about minimizing exposure. Every warning is about runaway cost. He wasn't trying to teach rulers how to conquer the world. He was trying to stop them from bankrupting themselves while trying. And that perspective, radical in his time, is what transforms The Art of War from a book about combat into something far more dangerous, a financial diagnosis of power itself. Because once you see war as a balance sheet, you can never unsee it. Once you strip away the poetry, The Art of War reads less like ancient philosophy and more like a financial audit. Sun Tzu doesn't open his treatise by rallying troops or praising courage. He opens by demanding calculation. Before a single soldier moves, before a banner is raised, the ruler must weigh variables, compare conditions, and decide whether the state can afford what it is about to attempt. Strategy, in Sun Tzu's mind, begins not on the battlefield but in the ledger. This is why his famous opening framework, the 5 fundamental factors of war, is so often misunderstood. The moral law, heaven, earth, the commander, and method and discipline sound philosophical, even mystical, to modern readers. But to Sun Tzu, these weren't abstractions. They were inputs, cost variables. The moral law wasn't about virtue, it was about internal stability. Would the population endure hardship without rebellion? Could the state extract resources without tearing itself apart? A war that required constant coercion at home was already too expensive. Heaven and earth weren't fate and destiny. They were time, weather, terrain, and distance, the natural forces that multiply cost. Marching in the wrong season, fighting in the wrong geography, extending supply lines too far, these weren't tactical mistakes. They were financial ones. The commander was not a heroic archetype. It was a risk profile. Was this general disciplined, patient, and economical, or reckless, emotional, and drawn to glory? One bad commander could burn through a treasury faster than a lost battle. And method and discipline wasn't about obedience for its own sake. It was about administrative efficiency. Could orders be executed cleanly? Could resources be moved without waste? Could corruption be controlled? Sun Tzu understood that disorder is expensive. From the very first page, the message is clear. Leaders who cannot calculate cost have no business calculating strategy. This explains why so much of the art of war is obsessively focused on logistics. Sun Tzu devotes entire sections to the economics of feeding, supplying, and sustaining an army. And his language is unusually blunt. He warns that when armies march far from home, prices skyrocket, labor shortages emerge, and the civilian economy begins to collapse under the weight of military demand. When your army is 20 miles from home, he writes, you lose the price of 100 measures of grain. This isn't metaphor, it's accounting. Distance equals cost, duration multiplies it. Sun Tzu explains that transporting supplies drains the treasury faster than paying troops themselves, that maintaining an army in the field pulls farmers from their land, reducing future harvests, that every wagon on the road represents both an immediate expense and a long-term economic wound. For a military treatise, it is strangely uninterested in combat. Battles appear almost as an afterthought. What Sun Tzu truly cares about is what happens before the clash, and what happens after the banners come down. This is why he scolds rulers who prolong campaigns, not because they lack courage, not because they hesitate, but because prolonged war is financial negligence. A short war strains the economy, a long war breaks it. And in a system where states depended on agricultural output and seasonal labor, the margin for error was thin. Sun Tzu understood that you could win every engagement and still lose the war, because the cost of fighting it hollowed out the state from within. This is also why he urges commanders to live off the enemy's resources whenever possible. Modern readers sometimes treat this as ruthless efficiency. In reality, it was fiscal survival. Every sack of grain taken from the enemy was a sack not taken from your own people. Every weapon captured was a weapon not purchased with tax revenue. Sun Tzu wasn't glorifying plunder, he was minimizing burn rate. And nowhere is his economic mindset clearer than in his treatment of intelligence. Today, intelligence is framed in terms of national security, secrecy, and ethics. Sun Tzu framed it in terms of return on investment. A single well-placed spy, he argued, could save a state from deploying an entire army in the wrong direction. A single piece of foreknowledge could prevent months of wasted marching, feeding, and fighting. What enables the wise sovereign and the good general to strike and conquer, he writes, is foreknowledge. Not bravery, not numbers. Foreknowledge. In modern language, Sun Tzu is saying something radical. Information is cheaper than force and vastly more powerful. Data, when correctly used, prevents catastrophic misallocation of resources. Ignorance, on the other hand, is expensive. To Sun Tzu, a war fought without intelligence wasn't bold. It was fiscally insane. Even his emphasis on speed, often misread as a call for aggression, is rooted in the same logic. Speed is the essence of war, not because haste is heroic, but because time costs money. Every day an army remains in motion increases its logistical footprint. Every delay compounds risk. Speed, in Sun Tzu's world, was cost control. Move quickly, strike where resistance is weakest. Avoid fortified positions that require prolonged sieges. Use deception to create openings rather than brute force to smash through them. These were not tactical preferences. They were economic necessities. Sun Tzu's ideal victory was not total destruction. It was rapid resolution. Because the true enemy was never just the opposing army, it was the slow, invisible erosion of the state's financial foundation. By the time you reach the middle of the art of war, the pattern becomes undeniable. Every principle, deception, flexibility, intelligence, speed, serves the same master. Not glory, not honor, but solvency. Sun Tzu had turned war into a balance sheet, and he was warning rulers that if they didn't learn to read it, history would liquidate them. Sun Tzu's ideas were not theoretical warnings meant for a distant future. They were urgent prescriptions for a system already cracking under its own weight. And history would prove again and again that states which ignored his logic didn't just lose wars, they quietly destroyed themselves. Because in the world Sun Tzu inhabited, collapse rarely arrived with trumpets or final battles. It arrived slowly, through empty granaries, unpaid soldiers, and populations stretched past their breaking point. Some kingdoms learned this lesson the hard way. They poured their wealth into prolonged sieges, massive standing armies, and campaigns driven by pride rather than calculation. They chased decisive victories while bleeding their tax base dry. At first, these states appeared powerful. Their armies were large, their offensives bold, their rulers confident. But beneath the surface, their economies were unraveling. Fields went untilled because farmers were conscripted. Markets distorted as grain prices soared. Taxes rose to fund campaigns that never seemed to end. Discontent spread, then rebellion. And when the external enemy finally struck, or an internal challenger emerged, these states discovered they had already spent the strength they thought they possessed. They didn't fall because they were defeated on the battlefield. They fell because they had nothing left to fight with. Other states made a different choice. They absorbed Sun Tzu's logic, even if they never explicitly credited him. They treated war not as a test of honor, but as a financial instrument, something to be used sparingly, strategically, and only when the return justified the cost. These states avoided drawn-out conflicts. They relied on alliances, intelligence, intimidation, and rapid maneuver rather than attrition. Instead of crushing enemies outright, they fractured them. Instead of occupying territory indefinitely, they destabilized rivals just enough to neutralize the threat. Instead of exhausting their own populations, they conserved labor, preserved agriculture, and maintained fiscal flexibility. These states survived longer, not because they were braver, but because they were disciplined. Sun Tzu had identified a pattern most rulers refuse to acknowledge. War rewards those who understand limits. The strongest state is not the one that fights the hardest, but the one that knows when fighting becomes too expensive. And this is what makes Sun Tzu such an anomaly in world history. While most military thinkers glorified battle, he treated it as a liability. While others focused on tactics, he focused on sustainability. While generals chased decisive engagements, Sun Tzu calculated opportunity cost. Every soldier deployed was a worker removed from production. Every campaign launched was a future harvest put at risk. Every victory purchased through exhaustion was a delayed defeat. He understood that power is not measured at the height of expansion, but at the moment of strain. A state's true strength reveals itself when pressure mounts, when resources thin, when morale weakens, when the bills come due. And the states that ignored this reality paid for it in ways that were brutally consistent. Internal revolts became more frequent as populations buckled under taxation and forced labor. Armies, once loyal, mutinied when supplies ran short or wages went unpaid. Rulers found themselves fighting enemies on two fronts, one across the border and one at home. Sun Tzu warned about this explicitly. A ruler who exhausts his people in pursuit of conquest, he argued, invites disaster. Not because the people are weak, but because the system can no longer support the strain. War, when mismanaged, does not merely weaken the enemy. It hollows out the state itself. And this is where Sun Tzu's thinking moves beyond military strategy and into political survival. He understood that a state is an economic organism. Drain it too quickly and it collapses. Overextend it and it fractures. No amount of battlefield success can compensate for systemic exhaustion. History proved him right, not just in ancient China, but wherever states mistook aggression for strength. Empires that expanded too rapidly found themselves unable to govern what they had conquered. Kingdoms that fought wars of prestige discovered that prestige doesn't feed populations. Leaders who believed victory justified any cost eventually learned that costs have a way of outliving victories. Sun Tzu was watching this happen in real time. He wasn't writing philosophy. He was documenting failure. And perhaps his most unsettling insight was this. States rarely recognize collapse while it's happening. From the inside, everything looks manageable. Another tax increase, another levy, another campaign to secure future stability. Each decision feels rational in isolation, until suddenly the margin is gone. This is why Sun Tzu despised leaders who enjoyed war for its own sake. Not because he was a pacifist, but because he understood the danger of confusing passion with policy. A ruler who loves warfare, Sun Tzu warned, will eventually ruin his kingdom. Behind the poetic language lies a cold accounting principle. If you treat war like a passion instead of a liability, you will eventually default. Sun Tzu's contemporaries didn't all listen. Many dismissed restraint as weakness. Many believed overwhelming force would solve structural problems. Many assumed their treasury could endure just a little more strain. Most of them were wrong. What survived were not the loudest states, nor the most aggressive ones, but the most economically disciplined. The ones that understood war as a tool, not an identity. The ones that accepted that restraint as not cowardice, but foresight. Sun Tzu didn't promise victory to those who followed him. He promised survival. And in a world tearing itself apart through endless conflict, survival was the rarest prize of all. Sun Tzu didn't vanish when the warring states ended. His warnings didn't die with the fall of a dynasty. They became a quiet, invisible pulse beneath every great conflict, whispering the same truth. Victory doesn't matter if your state can pay for it. Every empire since has stumbled over the same mistake he warned about. Nations march into wars, thinking courage, size, or firepower will decide outcomes. And yet, history tells a different story. Wars are rarely lost because soldiers were weak, generals incompetent, or plans flawed. They are lost because the economy behind them failed first. Consider the empires of the modern era. Imperial powers in World War I believed a clash of armies would secure dominance, but they failed to foresee the economic strain of mechanized warfare and total mobilization. By the time the guns fell silent, governments were bankrupt, populations exhausted, and social order fraying. The Soviet Union in Afghanistan, the United States in Vietnam. Conflicts that, on paper, should have been winnable were undone by fiscal overreach, prolonged campaigns, and mismanagement of resources. Sun Tzu would have recognized these patterns instantly. Prolonged warfare, he understood, erodes the state faster than any enemy ever could. Victory delayed is resources wasted. Victory pursued blindly is bankruptcy waiting to happen. And his methods, intelligence, deception, speed, and targeted operations, are still the backbone of modern strategy precisely because they are cheaper. Cyber warfare is Sun Tzu. Sanctions are Sun Tzu. Proxy conflicts, covert operations, strategic deterrence, these are all ways to achieve objectives without draining the treasury. Every modern strategist is unconsciously following Sun Tzu's ledger, but Sun Tzu's greatest insight isn't tactical, it's structural. He understood that national power is inseparable from economic stability. A state can deploy thousands of soldiers, build fleets, and conquer territory, yet remain weak if its foundation is financially fragile. Armies can be replaced, infrastructure can be rebuilt, morale can be rallied. But a drained treasury cannot. A bankrupt state cannot function, project power, or survive internal pressures. And that lesson is timeless. The tools and weapons have changed, but the principle hasn't. Strength is not measured by how hard you strike, but by how much you can afford to strike. Leaders who ignore this invariably pay the price. Economies collapse first, and wars follow second. Those who understand it endure, innovate, and preserve. Sun Tzu's genius was not in glorifying combat. It was in foreseeing the invisible cost of action, the long shadow that stretches from battlefield to treasury, from momentary triumph to long-term survival. He wrote not for generals seeking glory, but for rulers tasked with keeping a kingdom alive. And history proves the enduring value of that guidance. Even today, as nations grapple with budgets, resource shortages, debt crises, and global power projection, his principles remain relevant. Every decision about war, policy, or strategy is ultimately a financial decision. Every choice carries opportunity cost. Every misstep can bankrupt a state in ways no army can reverse. In the end, Sun Tzu teaches us that the greatest victory is the one you avoid paying for. The wars never fought, the resources preserved, the populations kept intact. These are the triumphs that endure. Not the stories of heroes on the battlefield, but the quiet, disciplined victories of survival and stability. History doesn't repeat itself, but if you ignore its lessons, it will cost you all the same. Sun Tzu's message is simple, unsettling, and eternally relevant. Don't chase glory, don't chase honor, chase solvency, protect your capital, preserve your state, win by staying alive. If this gave you a new perspective on history, strategy, and the invisible power of economics, hit subscribe. Thanks for watching.